I am not impressed by the moral argument. Hell, I'm not impressed by any religious philosophical drivel, but the moral argument is among the worst because it's all just assertion and assumption and nothing at all of any rational substance. So we're going to take that apart again today because what else can we do? But the religious aren't going to care about that at all because, yeah, it's all fifis and no facts. And that's just not something to be proud of, is it? This one comes from Michael Goff's channel, although the first part of it is just a bunch of William Lane Craig talking to Ben Shapiro, and we'll debunk that part quite easily. This is just emotions run amok, and that's mostly what religion is. These people just want to believe whatever it is they want to believe because whatever they want to believe makes them happy. But that doesn't make any of it true. It's not hard at all to see where they're going wrong. You'll just never be able to convince them of it because they're not using their brains for anything but holding up their hairpieces. So let's get into it because this is probably going to piss a lot of people off.
But the argument that they find, I think, the most compelling is what I call the moral argument.
Sorry, Bill, but the moral argument is just idiotic, and I'm sure we're going to go through it in some pretty great detail by the end. The moral argument means nothing if you're not a moral realist, and I'm not. Without really going into moral realism at the moment, it's essentially people who think that morality is objective, and I absolutely do not think that. In fact, I'm a moral anti-realist. I don't think that there are any objective moral values, period. I think the entire idea is absurd and based entirely on the desire for them to exist for emotional reasons. Anyone who has ever seen this channel before knows that that is absolutely not me. So, let's continue.
Does God exist?
Not that we have any evidence for or anything, because facts are objective. Morals are not. Evidence is based on facts, not fifis. Yes, I know I'm jumping around a lot, but I want to set up the framework up front. Virtually everyone agrees that we all live in an objective universe, and the people who say that they do disagree, and we have a few running around the channel now and then, but they still behave as if it is true because they don't really have a choice. The force of gravity is the same for me as it is for you. The speed of light is the same for me as it is for you. If there's a tree over there, then that tree is there for you, and if you disagree, I dare you to walk right through it. Because reality is the same for everyone, demonstrably. Not everyone might experience reality exactly the same way, because we know that sense data is fallible, but ultimately, reality is generally identical across the board from all of the evidence that we have. So when somebody says that God exists, then that must mean that God exists for everyone. And the only way we have to examine reality is through objectively verifiable evidence that anyone can see, at least potentially. So with that out of the way, let's let Michael continue.
Today we're going to look at a fascinating dialogue between William Lane Craig and Ben Shapiro as they prove the existence of God through logic.
No, they do nothing remotely of the sort. The problem isn't that both Lobar Bill and Ben are just both complete idiots when it comes to their religious beliefs, because they are. The problem is that logic is the wrong tool for the job. You cannot logically prove anything about objective reality with philosophy, solely with philosophy. It just can't be done. So we're already off to a very bad start, but I think it's only going to get worse. You might have seen this talk before already. It's been floating around the internet for a while. But I do think it's worth going through again, at least as much as Michael wants to show us, just to see how badly both of them get it wrong.
Using an argument William Lane Craig describes as the most compelling argument that he uses for university students today.
Which I guess says nothing very positive about university students then, does it? Now, that's not to say that they're dumb necessarily, but there are tons of videos that you can find out on YouTube where they'll go around and ask university students some really simple questions that anybody with half a brain ought to understand, and they can't answer them. And this is another problem with being taught what to think instead of being taught how to think, and that's how modern education works. But let's get to it, though. The prelude is completely unnecessary.
Whether you believe in God or whether you don't, I'm Michael Goff here at Chronicles of Clarity to help illustrate and show some of the intricacies of the moral argument.
Or not, I guess. Remember, I don't watch these things ahead of time, so I just guessed that he'd shut up and I was wrong. So it happens, I guess. Come on, nobody cares about you. Get back to the two dinguses.
I have 3 things you must understand about the moral argument. So, without further ado, let's listen to William Lane Craig and Ben Shapiro.
You can ignore philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past or scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. But the argument that they find, I think, the most compelling is what I call the moral argument.
We already did this. It is not rationally compelling. It's just emotionally appealing. People are, by their very nature, lazy. We evolved that way. Just about all animals did. It's why lions, for example, will just lay around all day relaxing, so they don't waste energy unnecessarily between meals. Humans are intellectually lazy if they allow themselves to be, which is why they are mostly looking for the simple answers to complex questions that they never have to doubt again, so they can just go on about their day without having to take any actual time considering their options. God is an easy answer to a lot of complicated questions that a lot of people embrace because it makes them happy, even though it is not remotely demonstrably true. It's why a lot of people just apply God to their moral quandaries too. It's easier than having to actually care about the truth.
And it would go like this. 1, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist.
Well, there's a lot of ways that we can look at that. On the one hand, he's right. Objective moral values and duties do not exist. He wants them to because it's a lot easier for him to think that there's this giant list of everything that you're supposed to do. And if you just embrace that list, hey, you're golden. You don't have to do anything else. You don't have to think about it anymore. On the other hand, though, he's wrong because even if there are these objective moral values and duties, which you have no evidence for whatsoever, that says nothing about the Christian God. And that's all he's talking about here, right? Well, who says it's his God? Because according to the Greeks, the answer is Dike. She was the goddess of justice, morality, order, etc., etc., etc. And she worked with her mother Themis, and together they were responsible for morality in the world. Now, Craig wouldn't like that answer, and there's a lot of other pantheons out there with their own versions of moral lawgivers too. So Craig can't just assert that his imaginary friend is the answer when he can't even show that his imaginary friend is real. So premise 1 is doubly toast. Keep going.
That is to say, in the absence of God, everything becomes socioculturally relative.
Which is actually how it works. Morality is the product of empathy and enlightened self-interest. We don't want other people to murder us, so we don't murder other people in the hopes that everybody else is just going to reciprocate and not do anything nasty to us. We know that murder would hurt ourselves, and because we don't like to be hurt, we don't murder others because we understand that our feelings are also present in other people. This is not that hard to understand. It's just not that emotionally comforting for people like Craig and Shapiro. but your emotions, they don't mean anything. Please grow the hell up.
2, but objective moral values and duties do exist. There are some moral absolutes, some objective values and duties.
Says who, and how do you demonstrate it? This is just an assertion made because it makes them feel better to think that it's true. But that doesn't make it true. If you talk to moral realists, that's the kind of answer that you're going to get. Well, I can't imagine there not being objective morals. Sorry, but your imagination has nothing whatsoever to do with reality. It's either that or, but most people think X is true. Sure, because all the people that you're polling are human, and humans have similar or even identical requirements for life. Most people don't want to die. Most people don't want to be hungry. Most people don't want to be abused. It's not hard to understand why most people generally feel the same way. The problem here is that not all people do. Because if morality is actually objective, if it's written on our hearts by God or whatever nonsense the religious come up with, then what most people do is irrelevant. So the religious have to explain why all people don't feel the same way, why all cultures aren't morally identical. For Christianity and similar religions, they've just invented sin as their go-to explanation because they really have nothing else. They've just made up an answer and are flogging it for all it's worth. But that doesn't make it true.
3, therefore God exists.
Which, given that the first two premises are just complete bullshit, it fails the critical sniff test entirely. This is why philosophy is useless for determining what actually exists in reality. His premises are just things that make him feel good. They are his personal opinions, not backed up by anything but his fifis and his faith. He wants them to be true, but that doesn't mean that they are. If it was that easy for me to poke holes in his silly claims, and it was ludicrously easy, then why can't Craig see what he's doing wrong? Because he doesn't want to. This happens throughout philosophy, religious or otherwise. Now, that's not to say that there aren't things that philosophy is good for. There certainly are, but this is not one of them. People need to stop pretending that philosophy is a panacea. It's not. No such things exist. This is just a shortcut to being intellectually lazy, and that's not something that anyone should respect.
Now, this is an argument which is impossible, I think, to ignore, because every day you get up, you answer by how you treat other people, whether you regard them as having intrinsic moral value, or whether they are mere means to be used for your ends.
And he's about to pull another nonsensical tactic that is very, very common. He's going to play the, well, if you don't agree with me, then there's something wrong with you card. And this happens a lot, and again, it's just a way to be lazy in our intellectual reasoning. This is just, I'm right, so there. Anyone who disagrees with me is wrong, so there. So there. But that doesn't mean anything. Here's the stuff that I find morally acceptable, and if you don't agree, well, you know. Yeah, but that's just stupid, though. It's back to lazy thinking. No conversation going on. You just have to be like Craig, or he's going to impugn your character. Well, fuck Craig. I could do the exact same thing he's doing. Reality is not based on a vote. Truth is truth and determined by evidence, not opinion. And I know this is very common in humanity, but it is still utterly irrational.
And so this argument, I find, tends to be the most convincing for people.
Except it shouldn't be. See, Craig is making a whole lot of assumptions here that simply are not justifiable. He just wants them to be true. If you're talking to other people who are already predisposed, either religiously or emotionally, to buy into this crap, then you're probably going to get a fair bit of agreement. But just because somebody agrees with you, that doesn't mean that what the two of you agree on is actually objectively true. Granted, the religious, they couldn't care about truth at all. They're only going for comfort, which is why most of Craig's ideas pander to the emotions, not to the intellect. He just tries to frame it in those terms so he can look better and people can look up to him as an intellectual when he's anything but. That is not what he's actually doing. So now it looks like Michael's going to do something else, which I guess is fine. So let's tune back in to see what that is.
So here are 3 things you must know. And the first one we address is found in the first premise.
Well, since the first premise is just question begging, it would have to be something about being intellectually honest. Granted, that's not what he's going to say because he wants to get to Christianity or godly morality or whatever it is, but the whole thing is utterly stupid, and therefore chasing your tail back to your predetermined conclusion is just silly. However, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and hope that the next words out of his mouth aren't really self-serving and stupid, but I don't know about you, but I'm not holding my breath.
Just as a reminder, I'll restate the first premise. It goes like this. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist.
Just stepping in here to point out that you could substitute anything at all for God, and it doesn't change the claim any. If invisible, intangible, universe-creating, morality-inventing pixies don't exist, then objective moral values, you don't just get to use God as an empty claim because it doesn't actually prove the premise. It just proves you're an idiot. It's just fallacious.
In that first part, if God exists, is my first point. The existence of God, not a belief in God. Premise number 1 does not say, if you believe in God. It says, if God exists.
Something that you still have not demonstrated to be true. This is why philosophy fails so miserably here, because just saying God exists does not mean that God exists. This entire thing is just, well, here's some stuff I want to be real, therefore I'm just going to assert that this thing that I believe is responsible for the stuff that I want to be real, well, that just means my imaginary friend exists. But none of that establishes the real existence of any gods, nor that they've actually done any of the things that you want to believe that they did. It's just claims, not demonstrable fact, and it's the demonstrable facts that we need. Your claims are entirely empty and useless.
And this is misunderstood by so many people. And maybe misunderstanding isn't exactly the right word. It's a reinterpretation. I found one time when I was discussing this with a friend of mine, he did this exact thing. I stated the first premise, the second premise, and the third, and his immediate response is, I don't have to believe in God to be good.
Well, that's true. Also, God doesn't have to exist for me to be good. I'm good or bad, all on my own. And that's the thing that the religious simply don't want to acknowledge. They just wish that God was real because it makes them feel all warm and tingly inside. But that isn't actually true in demonstrable reality. And it's the reality that matters here, not your childish fifis. It's why I am not remotely impressed with claims like this, because these are people who simply cannot get out of their own heads. What you want to be true is irrelevant. Only what is actually true is. And I saw a video on this a while back. I don't remember if it was a flashback on Atheist Experience or The Line, something like that. But I'm pretty sure it was Matt Dillahunty. But a theist called in, and they kept saying they couldn't imagine God not being real. And they had no evidence for it. He just couldn't imagine that all of his cherished beliefs weren't 100% true. And because of that, he was just never going to stop being a Christian. He couldn't handle reality.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
That's the problem with a lot of people. They can't handle the truth. Therefore, they just make something up because it sounds good to them and it provides comfort and, well, they're just too terrified to consider any other options, true or not. They don't care. And I know the religious get mad every single time I say that, but it is still absolutely the case. Because if they cared, then they would behave entirely differently. They would try to actually verify their beliefs with evidence. But they don't do that, do they? They're just proving what a bunch of idiots they are. And that's nothing to be proud of.
But of course, that's not what the first premise says. It says if God exists, and that is the key to this argument.
If is not because. Never has been and never will be. That if is doing a whole lot of heavy lifting there, isn't it? Because we all know what's really going on here. They don't see if, they see because. Because God exists, blah, blah, blah. Because they can't get it through their heads that God existing isn't a foregone conclusion. That's why apologists only talk to those who already believe, because they can't provide any evidence for any of the claims that they make. They just know who isn't going to ask for evidentiary support, and those are the people willing to fork over money into their coffers. And I know that sounds cynical, and maybe it is, but it also happens to be true, at least on some level. The apologists need money to survive, so they pander to the people most likely to give them money in exchange for the ridiculous hokum that they spew. Even if the apologists aren't consciously aware of what they're doing, it's still what they're doing. Let's not pretend otherwise.
The second thing you must know is also found in premise 1, and that is this: the difference between objective and subjective truth.
I don't know that subjective anything is actually true. Now, I suppose it depends on how you're going to define your terms. When I'm talking about truth, I mean that which is true or in accordance with fact or reality. Your feelings are completely irrelevant. If you didn't exist at all, if no one had ever existed, these things would still be objective facts that exist in the real world that I guess we don't share anymore. I mean, that's what I want. I don't want your subjective musings or the things that make you happy. If that's your truth, and that's your truth, which is just stupid, then you are an idiot. Don't be an idiot. So let's get back to Michael for his definition or whatever.
That means no matter what anyone else thinks, it would be a true statement that it is indeed wicked to kill innocent people. That would be objectively true.
And by all means, justify that for us without relying on your emotions. You're not going to be able to, because that statement, as much as most people are going to disagree, is entirely subjective. This is where a lot of people, not just the religious, but a lot of people, they go entirely off the rails with morality. They will look at that statement and assert that it applies to absolutely everyone equally because everybody's got to be just like they are, even if they're not. You have to feel like they feel. You have to think like they think. And that's not how it actually works. I'm struggling to find a situation where that would even be a possibility. Maybe if evil aliens showed up and demanded that we sacrifice 10 people or 100 people, whatever, doesn't really matter. Otherwise, they're going to wipe out all life on the planet. Sorry, but in that instance, those 10 or 100 people, they're just dead. That's not wicked necessarily, that's just survival. Granted, it is a situation that you don't want to find yourself in, but if it came down to a handful of lives or all of humanity, including my family, you better believe I'd pull that switch in a heartbeat. Would I feel bad about it afterwards? Probably. Would I want to be put into that situation? Absolutely not. But here's the thing. Morals are not objective. They are subjective and situational, whether you like it or not. They always have been, and they always will be. That is never going to change. It doesn't matter what everyone likes or what everyone believes. Reality is what it is. Deal with it.
By way of example, if the Nazis had won the war, it would still be the right position to say, objectively, it was wicked and evil what they did.
Only from your current perspective. Now, fast forward a couple of generations where everyone on the planet has been indoctrinated from birth to believe that what the Nazis did was fantastic, and you're going to get a lot of people disagreeing. I mean, it's not hard to find people right now who think Hitler did nothing wrong. He can't get out from behind his own preconceptions. Most people can't. Most people don't even bother to try. Once upon a time, the rules for slavery in the Bible sounded just fine for most people. Why? Because slavery was just a regular part of life. It was normal. Then, over a long period of time, societies changed. Now, Christians have a real problem trying to justify their current views on slavery with the views in the Bible because they do not align. They will go to extreme lengths to rationalize their way around it. Oh, well, it doesn't apply to us. Well, it never applied to anybody. Your views today are your views today. Their views then were their views then. If you had lived a couple thousand years ago, back in the days of Exodus 21, you would have thought differently too. They're going to try to deny that vehemently, but I'm sorry, you probably would have owned slaves. If you had lived in the time of the American slave trade, in certain places in the country, with certain beliefs, you probably would have owned slaves. That's just the way that it is. Deal with reality already. Anyhow, before we get to his third point, I think we're going to wrap it up for the week. It'll give you something to look forward to for next week, because I'm sure we all just champing at the bit, waiting to see what his third thing is that we must know about the moral argument. This is a hard thing for a lot of people to face, that a lot of the things that they believe about the world, they're just made up. People want to believe that they've got a really good handle on stuff, and I'm sorry, but most of the time, that's just not true. There is fact, that stuff that we can examine reasonably objectively and find verifiable evidence for, and then there's the model of reality that we construct in our heads that doesn't actually reflect what's going on out in the real world. This is the stuff that we embrace emotionally, not intellectually. Intellectually, this stuff just isn't real. It's social lubrication that makes it easier to get along in society without undue bloodshed. It's empathy and enlightened self-interest, and if you don't like it, sorry, but that's what's actually going on. People need to be able to step back and deal with the reality that they actually inhabit. What they want to be true is irrelevant. What is actually true, to the best of our ability to determine it, that's what matters. And this is why philosophy has so many problems when they try to do more than consider concepts subjectively. There are no demonstrable philosophical truths. There is only a mess of opinions wrapped up in form and rules. But that doesn't make any of it true outside of your head. That might help you to think about things more rationally and more clearly, but only if you can take yourself out of the picture. And for the vast majority of people, they just can't. They don't want to. It's why even having these conversations is often such a mess, because most people are just dumb. Don't be like most people. You can be better than that.